Hi, I'm Dr. Wilson. I'm a PhD molecular biologist, and welcome to another COVID debunking video. Let me start this one off with a quote. A vast amount of nonsense is talked on the subject of the risks of vaccination. Nearly all young children are vaccinated. Nearly all suffer from some ailment or other in the course of the next few months or years. But it is perfectly unreasonable to attribute any such ailment to vaccination merely because vaccination is antecedent. We might equally attribute street accidents to previous vaccination. When I look at some of my social media feeds, I can't help but see the relevance of this quote. Anti-vaxxers seem to want to pin any and every ailment or observation on vaccines just because vaccines are present. Now, if you're thinking this quote is from modern times, well, here's some news for you. This quote is about smallpox vaccines in the 1890s. Anti-vaxxers haven't gotten much new material in the past century, have they? And one news outlet that has done this a lot is GBNews, which is pretty much the new Infowars, the way they pump out disinformation and host fake experts constantly. I made a video previously about Dr. Malhotra's appearance on this show, and now we're returning again to address their claims of excess deaths in the UK, this time brought to us by a guy named Richard Innes. Let's hear what they have to say so that I can talk about why it's wrong.
Why are there all these excess deaths in Scotland 2021 and 2022?
Well, we've had a look at the data, and what we're trying to establish is, as you say, why is there this excess death in these two instances? This didn't occur in 2020.
What now? There were no excess deaths in 2020? Buddy, come on. This is painfully easy to disprove. All you have to do is look at the excess death data, which is available to anybody, and you can see that in 2020, when there was a wave of COVID, there was also a wave of excess deaths. Not hard.
The timing of this increase in deaths, and if you look at the timing, then it starts in the oldest age group, and it goes down successively into younger age groups. So that's increases in excess death occurring sequentially in increasingly lower age groups.
Are they? Excess deaths by age group in both Scotland and the UK are looking fairly normal in 2022. Excess deaths fluctuate naturally, and these fluctuations are pretty normal compared to other years. There's certainly nothing in the year 2022 that is nearly as concerning as the excess death we saw during COVID at its peak. But enough of him beating around the bush, let's get to what he's claiming is actually causing these excess deaths.
What we can do is we can run an experiment, and the government have run an experiment, and the experiment is that we apply what we think might be causing the excess deaths, and that is the vaccines. So we give a booster dose of the vaccines. And if our hypothesis about excess deaths being caused by vaccines is correct, we should see, once again, a rise in excess death about 12 to 14 weeks after the application of those experimental vaccines. And we had a look at the data in 2022, and that seems to be exactly what is happening.
Right, so there's his claim. COVID vaccines are causing excess deaths, and as he says, it should be easy to test this by looking at excess deaths and trying to correlate them to vaccine rollouts in each age group. Does this actually check out? No, of course not. Let's look at the actual data. Here are excess deaths for Scotland from January 5th, 2020 to October 16th, 2022. We can see that excess death peaks were highest during the year 2020 and the winter of 2021 for all age groups except the youngest, ages 0 to 14, in which case fluctuations in excess deaths seem relatively consistent, i.e. normal. Here's where vaccines were rolled out for each age group in Scotland. As you can see, you would be hard-pressed to find any convincing correlation here. Meanwhile, if we check COVID cases and confirmed COVID deaths, we can see that much better explains these peaks in excess deaths. We can even expand on Richard's little experiment here and see if this pans out in any country. We can check the data for any country that has sufficiently vaccinated its population and see if excess deaths have any correlation at all with vaccines. But instead we see the same trend. We see excess deaths being highly correlated with cases and confirmed COVID deaths, not vaccines. But we can do even better than that. We can look more directly at the two populations, vaccinated and unvaccinated, and ask specific questions such as, which one is dying more often from COVID, or which one is dying more often, period. And now I've talked about this list of studies in my last few videos, but here it is again, several studies from several different countries spanning ideologies, governments, and scientific institutions. All of them agree and find the same thing over and over again, that vaccines are very safe and they are really effective at preventing COVID deaths and severe outcomes from COVID. There are no unexplained excess deaths that can be attributed to COVID vaccines. There just aren't. But that doesn't stop people from making those claims. For example, on GBNews, it has been claimed that excess deaths in England are, of course, due to COVID vaccines. While it is true that earlier in the year, England was exhibiting excess deaths that were slightly above other European countries, this was due to an emergency room crisis. Longer wait times at emergency rooms were leading to hundreds of excess deaths. It's as simple as that. But I'd like to use this example to talk about how you might be able to think through some of these claims. If people are saying, for example, that there are excess deaths in England and that is suspicious, and that it's probably due to COVID vaccines, well, you can ask a few simple questions in order to think through and determine whether or not that is true. First, you can ask, if COVID vaccines have been widely rolled out to several countries, why only England? Why would they be special in being affected by whatever the vaccine is causing to happen? The answer is nothing. It shouldn't be that way. If vaccines are causing excess deaths, you should see a consistent effect across populations. We don't see that. The second thing you can ask is, how are the vaccines causing this? Is there an actual causative explanation for the vaccines to be having such an effect? Because after all, it's one thing to demonstrate such a correlation, even though that hasn't been demonstrated, but it's an entirely other thing to come up with a causative mechanism. It's not good enough to say, this is mysterious, this needs investigated, therefore vaccines are bad. You have to have done some actual work here. You have to have ruled out enough other reasonable options to have some suspicion that it might be vaccines. Anti-vaxxers are incapable of doing this. But I digress. Let's get back to Richard and what he has to say.
Even though at the very beginning people predicted that these are untested, they're not really vaccines, they're experimental gene therapies.
I don't know if this still needs explaining, but no, COVID vaccines are not gene therapies, and yes, they have been extensively tested. The specific goal of gene therapies is to actually change the host's DNA in order to correct a genetic disorder that is causing a disease state. mRNA doesn't do that. If you don't understand this, please go back to your high school biology class and get a refresher. And yes, COVID vaccines have been extensively tested for safety. Their testing process did not skip any steps. They were fast-tracked. They were not rushed. It's like ordering a package from Amazon and getting it on Prime. You expect the process to go smoothly and end up with a good product. You don't expect anything to be rushed and sloppy. It's the same thing with COVID vaccines. EUAs are just as rigorous of an approval process as regular approval is. It's just prioritized. That's all.
But if you look at the death rates of April and May, basically 93% of deaths were in COVID deaths were in the vaccinated population, and this is on the government's own figures. That corresponds exactly to the number of people who are supposedly vaccinated. So they have no benefits.
Oh, Mark Stein, host of GBNews, you are an unfortunate victim of the base rate fallacy. In the UK, most of the population, and especially most of the vulnerable population, are vaccinated for COVID. So you would expect most of the COVID deaths to be occurring in the vaccinated group. However, you would expect much fewer COVID deaths than ever before. And that's exactly what we see, because COVID vaccines are reducing the total number of deaths by a substantial margin. Let's take the example of Hong Kong and New Zealand. New Zealand had a very successful vaccination campaign that saw up to 98% of its elderly population vaccinated for COVID. Meanwhile, Hong Kong had a relatively unsuccessful vaccination campaign with a significant fraction of the elderly population not getting vaccinated. The result? Well, you can see that COVID vaccines do, in fact, have a very protective effect, just as they are supposed to. GB News. It might be the new Infowars, but it sure has the same old, easily debunked claims. And there you have it. Wrong claims that reflect those that were made over a century ago are still wrong today. Go figure. Well, that's going to do it for this week's video. As always, all the links to all the science that I talk about in this video are linked in the description below so that you can read them for yourself. As always, thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. If you enjoyed this, maybe check out my Patreon or subscribe so that you can catch me next week where I'll be debunking some more funky stuff. See you then.